back today, everyone. I think that's more than talking here. I would like to show, but more on that in a moment. The keyword is GenAI. We are talking about data. I think it would be impossible to hold such a conference without throwing this term around a few times left and right. Has anyone here used a chat with LLM? No one? No one has heard recently? Where did you all come from today? And has anyone worked beyond just chatting with such a chat? For example, with documents trying to help yourself at work? Okay, so there was some contact, some practical application. Yesterday, Łukasz and today Kamil also mentioned organizations and their level in the context of analytics and so on. What caught my attention in this context is that this chat, when we talk to it, when we talk about organizations that are guided by intuition, I think this chat has something that, compared to other classic machine learning methods or traditional OCR, can be characterized as having some sort of intuition. This is, of course, a context based on data, on the complexity and sophistication of these models, on their technological advancement. But this intuition, or context, whatever we call it, or the hypothetical intelligence we talk about, allows us to accomplish new tasks. Thanks to the fact that these LLM models are not just a chat, they are actually a great machine that can handle all kinds of content nowadays, from text through various types of documents, photos, videos, to audio. Very often, it can also generate such content. So it not only can consume it, but also do something with it. And in our work, also together with our clients, we see many practical applications. One such application is precisely in the context of data structuring from documents. Kamil also mentioned yesterday that in a previous job, he inherited a cabinet full of binders from his predecessor. So, to some extent, each of us processes certain documents, invoices, contracts, CVs, and we want to show how easily we can process such documents with the help of new technologies. We can structure them, we can classify them. On the screen, we see a demo of a very simple application, and we will soon go through the process of creating the configuration for this application so that it can help us with our documents. We will process sample documents. This is, of course, just a fraction of what we can do, and a fraction that I would like you to take with you, with the thought of comparing it with the processes in your companies, organizations, or daily life, to truly see how easily we can extract the value from all of this. All right. What can this magical machine do? It can accept document definitions from us, a document definition that allows us to configure this tool to handle various types of documents, such as invoices, CVs, or whatever else we can think of. Currently, for our demonstration purposes, it supports PDF files. All right, invoices. I think everyone has seen an invoice to some extent. So maybe let's start with that as a simple example. An invoice consists of a lot of information, right? Information that includes, on one hand, standard data like the issuer's details, buyer's details, tax information, VAT amounts, and so on and so on. And here on the screen, we see example fields listed prepared in a way for this tool so that it can work with these documents and do it in a way that suits us. So if we don't need something, we simply don't extract it. We declare what is important to us regarding the source of this information and how we want to extract this information. And what is important, and what we will see later, is that it's not just about reading raw data. We have a much greater capabilities in working with this context. We have the ability to classify these documents. We have the ability to classify their content and not just read raw data. To continue with this workflow using this sample application. So after we have declared the fields, we can upload documents here, send them to the program, to this magical black box, and keep our fingers crossed that everything works, right? So maybe let's do that. I'll go ahead and upload a sample invoice like mine. We can see that there are already quite a few documents processed here. I will soon show their results. And at the bottom, we have a new document that is not processed. I would like to point out, maybe it's not very visible, that we have a column with the document type, whether it's a CV or an insurance policy. And for this document at the very bottom, which I just placed here, there is no type. So in the document types, I had declared several types of these documents. However, now after uploading a new document into the program, I don't have any type assigned to this document yet. And what I would like to emphasize is that I don't have to worry about it, that we can build these tools according to our needs so that they handle the assessment of what type of document it is. It doesn't have to be a document. It can be a photo, a video, or other content. So for these needs, I will take a look, filter this one document, and start its processing, which could, of course, be automated every time after, uploading this file into the program. And at this point, based on the configuration I created, the GenAI model is trying hard, firstly, to classify this document, and secondly, once it classifies it, it is able to extract data from it according to my preferences that were configured on the screen we saw earlier. And this is the latest invoice. I see that it was just uploaded here a moment ago. We already have an additional button here. Okay. And for now, this is just a preview of the data. I will also show you the invoice itself, so you can see what we have here. It is indeed an invoice for telecommunication services. And let's note that it also has several pages, right? I wasn't concerned here about the document being multi-page. It is split across several pages. But the LLM handled it excellently. This is a PDF. It was uploaded as a PDF. However, it would also be possible with an image, a scan, a JPG file, and so on. For example, I will also show you a table, but I will hide one column so that the table doesn't get misaligned. Sample data. These are all my invoices, so please don't take too many pictures, but there's nothing secret here. An example of such a table after processing many different documents from various suppliers. Here are invoices for a train ticket and for the internet. Invoices for the purchase of a monitor. Various types of documents from different issuers. However, the data itself is structured, processed automatically, available here, and I can also preview this data. if this were not handled, it could be empty or classified as unclassified. This is configurable, yes, basically. So you can design a path that would require, for example, human intervention, such as additional verification as a step. Here we have an example of an invoice versus data, side by side. Of course, this is probably not a revolution for many of you, because if someone has any kind of accounting nowadays, then probably invoices are processed quite well by that accounting. But to raise the level of difficulty beyond just the fact of classification, which was done automatically, we will look at other documents, at CVs. I will also hide some columns, so as not to break up this table too much. We have processed several CV documents, and these CVs also look very different from each other. Let's look at the first one. Relatively simple, textual. And let's consider what we have in such a document on a daily basis. We have a candidate's description. We have their data. Great. But what is important for us as a potential employer when we receive 500 or 1,000 of these CVs? Of course, filtering out those candidates who have the key skills we are looking for at the moment, so that we can continue contact with them first, because we want to shorten the recruitment process. So here, you can not only rely on pure text reading. What is important in the case of such documents is capturing the context. The context that is important to us in terms of the given role. Because if we are recruiting for a technical role, in this case, a data engineer, it is important for us what programming skills the candidate possesses. In this case, for example, Python and SQL. Or which programming tools they have used, such as Pandas, NumPy, SQL Alchemy, and others. Overall experience is also something that might matter to us. This could also be narrowed down, for example, to total experience in the industry. What is important is also the ability to classify. Not only as we classify the document, but also the classification of what we read from it. I will take the liberty to return to the list of document types and check the configuration for the CV document. What do we have here? We have education. If I check the description of this field and its configuration, I see that it is configured as mandatory. So, this magic machine, this model, will always try to fill in this data. But what is important is that I only accept a few values in this field. So if I want to structure this data, I am able to manage how this data will be extracted in a relatively soft, somewhat intuitive way. Whether it will be an enumeration of several values, rather than just relying on extracting raw text, in a rigid way as the candidate entered it. To demonstrate how easy it is to add such fields and extract new data from these documents, for the purposes of our recruitment, I will add a new field here and set the microphone aside for a moment. I'll just add that this wasn't planned beforehand, so Slawek is actually adding it live. You can see it quite quickly right now to start on the computer. All right, I'll add a field where I want to check if the candidate has described in their CV that they have completed any commercial projects using BigQuery, because I want to strengthen my data engineering team, but I'm looking for someone primarily who has practical experience with BigQuery, so I'll add this field. And of course, it won't magically appear here because these documents have already been processed earlier. But if I filter them and run their processing once again, if everything goes well, this additional information should be found among these CVs. So in a subtle way, I'm able to extract information, again, by looking at the entire context of the document. We don't just focus on finding a keyword loop, like someone listing BigQuery under interests, instead of something normal like running or cycling, but we actually check whether this information is important to us in the context of the entire document in the way we define it. 3 documents have been processed. I will go back to the table that shows all of them. I'll just hide these skills and we'll look at this one. And we see that 2 of our candidates have mentions in their CVs indicating that they have worked with BigQuery. So let's take a look. We have Mr. Oliver. Here we see that the CV itself is already nicely formatted, but that wasn't a problem for the model. And we see that indeed, looking at the processes Mr. Oliver implemented here, we can reasonably assume that while working in GCP and implementing data warehouses, he worked with BigQuery. Not just based on the fact that it's listed in the skills section. In this way, we can, of course, be limited only by our creativity. What I also want to emphasize is that the models we work with are getting better month by month. So documents or data that were a problem for these models some time ago are no longer an issue now. And we can, of course, consider how to expand such tools in the context of our companies to automate the entire process. Because one might wonder, why do I only need the data read? Maybe I want to do something with it. Maybe I want to ask the candidate something if certain information is missing from the CV, or perhaps I would like to generate actions for each document. For example, if an invoice has a future payment date, I would like an automatic reminder to be added to the calendar, right? So, such solutions are definitely possible as the next steps. But finally, as a treat, since I'm a relatively lazy person, I also thought about a function here. We thought about a function to see how the model would handle proposing the structure of these fields, so we don't have to enter it manually. Instead, we can start with something the model suggests by preparing a new type of document. And after uploading 3 files, we provide a kind of sample of these documents here. Please note that later I will process 4. The one at the top, which has WH in its name, I am not uploading. And if all goes well, after a few dozen seconds to such an initial structure of fields and their grouping should be prepared. Well, because if we see several repeating documents and build a tool appropriately for this purpose, so that it performs this task for us, then the next step is made easier. We become even more efficient and can focus even more on what is important to us. In this case, we are working with the Gemini model. For this particular task, I am using Gemini 2.5. This is an experimental version of the model, but it is powerful, truly, as a point of interest. And to fill your time, hopefully without boring you, I had the opportunity to work with this model, where I worked on documents that were 500 pages long, for example. And I wanted to have a summary, a table, extract certain information, and it handled it excellently. So just to give context about the computational power we're talking about, we see that a type of document called train ticket has appeared here. We have certain groups. Maybe let's start with that. Okay, what types of data can be on a train ticket? Data related to the passenger, the route, the seat, and so on and so forth. We see that within these groups, fields have been created, along with descriptions, according to the structure allowed by the program. To see how this works in practice and if it proves effective, I will upload 4 files here, and I will definitely request the program to process them, and we will see what we get as a result. These are, of course, simple documents, examples of documents that are easy for me to demonstrate as well. Since we are often talking about sensitive documents, we are able to ensure the security of such processing by relying on solutions from reputable companies. However, for demonstration purposes, I am showing documents and working with documents that do not raise any significant questions regarding security and display, but they have a very varied structure. This is important because we are not locking ourselves into a rigid solution that only works with one type of document. And what is also great is that when these documents change, we don't have to throw the entire tool away or invest a lot of effort to adjust the tool, right? Like with those CVs, if I needed to add a new field to check if the candidate has commercial experience with BigQuery, it took a minute and only required reprocessing the documents that had already been uploaded to the program. The last ticket is being processed. Sure. There is confidential data. There is an instruction, right? I mean, the program is designed in such a way, of course, it uses an LLM model underneath, naturally, but we can work with these models to require them to structure their responses. For example, in the form of JSON, in the form of, so if we build such an application properly, we can easily ensure that the model's response has a specific format, and it can be used, for example, as JSON to send it to another system. Or it generally allows for building a web application, because for such an application, we already need some structuring of this data. On one hand, it's a kind of paradox. I don't want to waste time and dwell too much on the fact that we use models capable of working with any data just to structure that data. Again, even though earlier we were happy that we finally have something that doesn't require structured data and we can talk to it like a human, in quotes, right? So it's a kind of paradox, but a very useful one, because we do like order, right? It's easier for us to work if we have some order in documents. And for example, train tickets, going back to what has been processed here. Very nicely extracted data concerning the location. Of course, some corrections could be useful here. For example, we have the information that the ticket was issued by PKP Informatica. And is that incorrect information? On the invoice here in the lower right corner, I mean on the ticket, there is indeed such information. So the model wasn't strictly wrong, but maybe we would like to classify this issuer into one of several we work with and have it in a structured form. That would be equally possible. Here we also have a ticket that looks a bit different. Why? I don't know, but the model handled it excellently as well. Those looked a bit less attractive. They weren't as colorful. This one has a completely different form. However, all the travel information was extracted from the document. All right. Questions.
How much money did we spend during this presentation?
Money? Well, I don't know. Maybe Polish grossy. To be honest, the efficiency of these models and their cost is drastically low in the sense that in reality, the main workload involves identifying the business need, designing the process, building the interface or the programming shell process to execute everything in a secure environment, and providing the data to the model in terms of specific files. However, once we handle the processing properly, over the years or with further co-usage, it becomes incredibly efficient. And pardon the expression, even the cheapest student will never be competitive with it, right? In the sense that processing hundreds or thousands of pages still only costs us a few or $12. This also stems from the fact that the more secure we want the process to be, the more steps we can implement. Here it looks very simple and the model handles it great, but we could add a few filters, just like in companies, where if we want to avoid errors, document processing is reviewed by several people, right? One person checks it, then another person, to catch errors in several places. Similarly, here we can design the application in such a way that after completing one step, it checks and acts as an independent verifier of itself.
And what about handwriting?
With mine, there would be a problem. But it's not bad, right? If it's a form filled out. With relatively printed letters, we can work with that. Very often, in such situations, we can use a combination of certain techniques, more traditional techniques, OCR-based, and process such a document more OCR-like, and then pass this document and the results of this extraction for further work to expand the context for the model. So if it's not just a scribble, but a reasonably filled out document, there's a chance that it can still perform a large part of this work for us.
Can this also serve as a knowledge base, for example, to later build a company database, like, I don't know, a knowledge base, a fact base for employees?
Yes, of course, we can expand such tools, right? Since we already have these documents somewhere, we can easily not only use this table to search for documents, but if these were longer documents, we can implement contextual search, meaning consider and search through, for example, a list of 1,000 CVs. I'm looking for candidates who culturally seem to be funny, have such and such hobbies, and so on and so forth. And search for candidates among these CVs in a softer way, for example, rather than specifically filtering by certain fields. And of course, such a search will have some level of variability and accuracy, but we can build such contextual searches as well as a knowledge base on this basis.
Thank you.
There is a question from Mr. Biały. Schultz. The boss said, I think that not several working days, but probably a few more. It's a high few, but between a few and several working days of work, maybe. Something like that. This also results from the fact that AI allows us to utilize very nicely if we know how to do it, to speed up programming. I personally also use it, and as a team, we try to use it in our work to become more and more efficient. So I think several times that, of course, this is a simple demo, but much more.
Yes, this demo, it was created for a pre-sales conversation with a client from the insurance industry and was developed in a few days. And there we also have such information from there regarding the return rate. From the implementation processing, documents at the client cost about 2 PLN per document. Already in the third month, after considering all production costs, the processing cost practically already had a return rate. So we had a 290% annual return rate from what we calculated against the labor costs of processing these documents.
I will return to Martin's question because it brings up one very important thing. Very important. When we think about costs, we immediately think of large projects somewhat in the context of this architecture, cloud, and so on, that the cloud allows us a quick start. It's easy to build projects that test certain assumptions and solutions. If we have an idea, if we have a certain concept of what we can do, it's easy. First and foremost, we are able to test it. Because, of course, releasing it into production, it's a bit challenging, right? Besides, it doesn't have many useful functionalities yet. But the testing itself, the experimenting source itself, considering whether it fits, actually for my needs, it doesn't have to cost much anymore. It can actually be realized in a few days. Most models that are made available, if we use them via API, are normally already paid, and so on, not within some subscription framework. We only pay for what we use, and then they are limited. But these default limitations are already very high. What is used for data reading here, I believe, uses Gemini 2.0 Flash. And there, I think the limit, it's 1,000 queries per minute in theory. In terms of processing here, the program does not have parallel processing set up, but in production applications, such parallelization is possible, and these limits are very high. The backend primarily gathers information about the files in the sense of configuration, so it requires appropriate data modeling in the backend. And based on this, indeed, in a clever way, we build cooperation with the model. And I wouldn't want to talk about it in more detail, but it is generally about translating this configuration into working with the model later to be able to work with it in a flexible way.
I saw there was another question.
What is the situation regarding the security of data that is being processed and those already processed? I mean, we're talking about the values that have been extracted from the documents. Where are they processed in a physical sense? Who is responsible for that? And in the event of a data breach, how do we respond?
I mean, this is a question that I understand in the context as if it were a production application. Well, here we're talking about a demo that is currently running locally on my computer, in this case, right? In the case of a production application, if, for example, we were to run such an application on one of your clouds, then after processing, the data would be in your cloud infrastructure in the database. And then the same rules apply as for the data from your mobile applications, e-commerce platforms, and stores. If we have it in the database, it's essentially a matter of implementation. And basically, It's not different from working with any other systems, right? Well, the only caveat to keep in mind is that during processing, the document is actually sent to the LLM. However, if we use paid APIs based on the terms and conditions of LLM providers, this data is used only for processing at the time of processing and can never be used by them for training or collection later on.
However, when using, for example, Gemini, if we use it through Vertex, it still remains within our cloud subscription, right? Or not?
Yes, then the billing is through the cloud and everything is linked to the cloud.
I would like to ask about some models. Were any other models tested for recognizing this type of workloads?
Mostly for convenience. I actually work with Gemini in its various versions, depending on the complexity of the task. But we also worked with some OpenAI models in our company and tested Sonnet's cloud as well. Well, mainly those big players. Sometimes we also supported ourselves with separate OCR solutions with other solutions, specifically Python-based ones. We can also discuss the details of that.
In the end, generally regarding hallucinations, some glitches, right? Let's say accuracy. How does it look in terms of precision? Because it's known that models can sometimes fudge things a bit, right?
Well, yes, there are no elements of such verification here, right? At the moment. But with documents that don't have handwriting, let's say those tickets and so on, I haven't done quantitative tests, but I think it's in the high 90% range, such effectiveness. And if we wanted to improve it, it's just a matter of the amount of work involved. Understood also as, for example, the next testing step.
Regarding the scale, I also think that in Krzysiek's next presentation, the scale will be shown.
I have a question about tables and PDFs because I know that these LLMs don't quite handle tables well. Do you have any experience?
I do, and I recommend scheduling a 30-minute slot in my calendar. We have a different demo for that, and I'd be happy to show it, but not right now. So we're quite capable of reading data from tables and then, for example, presenting and saving it in an interesting way. We can imagine virtually any configurations. If we are satisfied with the result of this extraction, then, for example, we can potentially load only selected columns from this table into a database. If we want to automate the process of feeding the database from documents in this way, just thinking loosely.
Looking at this example with the CV, it reminded me of a story where people on the internet recommended, for instance, pasting some instruction that overwrites such LLMs, and, for example, masking it in white so that it isn't visible at first glance. Are you prepared for something like that? For such injections?
Well, yes. In this demo example, it's somewhat simpler because we have a very rigid interface, right? Because this is a web-like application where we essentially pass certain files, pass certain document configurations, and since it's processed by the application's backend, before being sent to the LLM, we are able to handle it, right? In the case of demos with chats, such as virtual assistants, we also implemented additional checks, not only technical ones regarding the prompt itself, but also semantic ones to detect whether the text entered by the user is potentially harmful and an attempt to extract information or bypass the model's instructions. So there are several ways to address this. Additionally, most models provided by suppliers have their own limitations on what they can return, meaning they typically filter out hate speech, sexual content, and similar categories by default. When configuring the application and model, we can ensure that we do not inadvertently offend our user in any way.
Do we have any more questions? I don't think so. So just to add at the end, there was a question earlier about costs. In the case of such proofs of concept, if you have a representative either at OpenAI or Google Cloud, you can most likely get credits for these POCs to check if it will work or not. So I also recommend getting in touch either with us or directly with the vendor. Okay. Thank you, Slawomir, for the